Bob, we'll have you start, and then we'll get the screen share going, and we'll get started.
All right, great. Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Always good to have people talking about writing. So I'm going to take you through a few introductory things just so we get started. And as Jaime said, please, unmute, jump right in. This is the kind of situation where we want to make sure that you get your questions answered, and would love to know what's on your mind as we shared. So really, just as the title slide indicates, we'll be talking about a collaboration that came right out of ERDI. Really, this is the type of thing that happens when you go and participate in ERDI. Partners come together to really try to tackle something that I consider as a superintendent so important for student learning. So I want to share with you an agenda. Don't let it bowl you over. You might feel like, wow, those are a lot of agenda items, but we promise that it will be gentle and not, 15 bullet points with 20 slides for each bullet point. Just want to walk you from goals and introductions, the problem that we came to, but we also want to tell you the story of how we came together and then say, hey, how can we turn this into an academic, a platform, research project that could benefit students, could benefit our profession, could take advantage of the National Writing Project, could use a very, very powerful tool that Scribble is developing and that we think can be a tonic for teaching writing. It says number 16, question and answer, but just once again, please, there's just no in these kind of meetings, jump right in. We'll be monitoring the chat. Please put it in the chat. But also, if you're not getting that kind of attention, just unmute and say, oh, excuse me, Bob. Hey, Victor. Hey, Elise. So goals. I just want to talk a little bit about the goals of this project. And I think for each of us, our goals started out separately. And it might be, hyperbole to say a writing skills crisis. But one of the things that I've talked to many superintendents, people on my staff, at least in Illinois, when No Child Left Behind came about in 2001, my state, Illinois, had a very robust writing assessment as part of its state assessment. When No Child Left Behind came, dropped it. And one of the antecedents, the effects of that was with it leaving the scene of state testing, it also started leaving the scene of professional development, school focus, and many of us started noticing a crisis. In essence, there's a question, a goal that I have as a superintendent, and that is, how do we design better writing assignments? How do we teach writing in a way that is accessible to today's student? And at the same time, when we have new actors like ChatGPT walk on the stage, how do we deal with that and deal with the myriad of distractions that students might experience when they are attempting to learn how to compose and write? So we also want to share today just a three-way collaborative partnership. We really want to focus on best practices in both teaching writing and assessing writing, more than, oh, this is a webinar, a conversation about how to ChatGPT proof your school district. We want to share some thoughts about ChatGPT and other generative AI. I would argue that generative AI has been around on the writing scene for quite some time. And then also there's a little bit of recruitment here in that we're hoping that we move forward with the United States Department of Education in terms of we're in a research and development grant phase, and we're hoping to go into a second phase. We've completed a first phase. So that is all right now on the docket in terms of goals for this. Just a few introductions. I've been doing most of the talking, but I would just share my name again, Bob McBride. I'm the superintendent of Lockport Township High School District 205. We are a very large high school only district. That's a thing you see frequently in Illinois because we serve a whole township, a 65 square mile area, southwest of Chicago, right snug under Joliet, if you recognize that city. I have a background in writing. Actually, I majored in writing in college with a very specific focus, and it's been a thread throughout my career. I want to turn it over to you, Elise.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elise Eidman-Adol, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Writing Project. And probably some of you know the National Writing Project. Maybe you've connected with your local writing project. We're almost 50 years old. We're a national network of local writing projects where teachers engage together in learning about and providing local leadership for improving writing instruction, which has meant many different things over the almost 50 years we've been around. One of the things it means now is actually working with tech development partners and others, as well as our classic partners in school districts, in order to improve writing instruction using all the tools that teachers have at their disposal. So happy to be here and great to meet everybody at ERDI.
Hi, everybody. I'm Victor, co-founder and CEO of Scribble. Some of you know me from the institutes, but for those that don't, I started the company because I needed something like Scribble way back originally as a student to really address my own needs to do basically evidence-based writing, so research and writing needs. And with Scribble, we've been with ERDI for a few years now and done a number of panels. But for those that don't know us, basically we've built a really robust kind of system. It's a platform. At least in the past, has actually called it infrastructure for writing, which I take as a compliment coming from NWP. But it's the most robust system anybody's ever really built to support students and educators through the research and writing process. So excited to be here and really excited to share our story on collaboration with all of you.
And let me just maybe frame the entire conversation with the problem. And I hope I don't come off in any kind of way of self-aggrandizing. I am an English teacher, but I have a very different journey to teaching English than most English teachers. As I mentioned, I was not a literature major at my college. I was in the writing program and focused exclusively on producing writing for publication, producing writing for art. So I specifically not only was a writer and learner, but also took classes on how to teach writing. When I graduated from college, I spent almost 20 years working for public television, WGBH, as a professional writer until my life just got so complex I couldn't do that. So I really think about things as someone who's written professionally, who has that background. But also something for everyone to be aware of. Most teachers, regardless of their humanities background, have not ever had a specific class in how to teach writing. I currently teach at North Central College in the Department of Education. I work with many future English teachers. Our curriculum still does not have a class and specifically on how to teach writing, assess it, make it part of a student's performance. Most of what English teachers learn still is what they learn from each other. And I might even argue that many teachers assign writing, but not teach writing. And there's a big difference. So this was a problem that all three of us were thinking of. And when we came together, we wanted to address. Just a superintendent perspective on this. And I think Victor will flip to the next slide. I had some very specific things when I connected with Victor and with Elise. First, I was thinking about that problem, and I wanted to initiate our staff, primarily of English teachers, into some design thinking. Oftentimes, teachers come late into the process. A leader, a department chair, a principal, an assistant superintendent, a superintendent brings a curriculum, brings a platform to them and says, this is great. And now you are going to figure out how to use it in the classroom. At ERDI, I met Victor, and what I wanted to do was two things. One, knowing the National Writing Project and having so much connection to it in my teaching career, I believe it's the gold standard of how to teach students how to write. But also I saw an opportunity with working with Victor to bring teachers into the ground floor, not of receiving a platform or receiving a curriculum and sorting out how to use it, but to actually be involved in the process of creating that platform. In this particular case, a platform we'll talk to you about that has to do, called GWOC, that has to do with assessing writing. So bringing them into design thinking where they weren't just simply receiving something, they were going to be at the ground floor of helping to build it. Now, Dr. Lori Cristofero is in here. Lori, you are an eloquent spokesperson. She's our assistant superintendent. I don't know if you mind unmuting, but you've talked about another goal that we had as leaders was involving our English teachers in contributing something to the profession. Lori, do you mind just unmuting really quickly and sharing your thought about that?
Hi, everyone. I just think as a profession as a whole, we don't do enough to share all the great things that are happening. So I'm applauding Bob and the team today for sharing the work that's happening in ERDI for making something like this happening. But our team, I've challenged them and collaborated with them to create a journal-like article about our experience with this, because that allows for additional growth and processing about what they've learned. And I've also asked them to submit a proposal to present next year at the Conference on English Leadership. Again, I think it gets the word out about how, when you engage with something like the National Writing Project, can fuel even greater learning by teachers in their practice, but then share amongst the profession.
And our hope, by exposing our teachers to the National Writing Project, to being energized in something like a platform design, yeah, it's stretching them. Anybody here who's been to an ERDI symposium or summit, I always feel stretched when I leave. That, gosh, I have so much to learn, I have so much to do, but stretching our teachers in a good way. And particularly, as Lori mentioned, in a way that's contributing to their own professional development, but also contributing to our academic profession. What I hope is that stretch shows that we value them, and that it accompanies the gratification that we all feel when we can actually look at our work and it's shared with others. So that is my perspective. Elise, National Writing Project.
Well, first off, for anybody who's developing and concerned and thinking about teacher leadership and teachers engaged in design thinking, I have to say, when we met Bob and Lori, we were like, oh my gosh, Lockport is a district that is the beautiful example of valuing that and wanting to support that. So I think you just heard that from both of them. Thank you both. To pick up on this design thinking piece, back in the early 2010s, right after the adoption in many places of the Common Core state standards, or standards that were similar to that, maybe, and not called Common Core state standards, much of the nation started to pay attention to the writing, particularly of argument. You might remember that was a period when argument was getting tremendous attention newly, and a lot of districts were saying, we're not sure what we're dealing with in argument. I don't know that we do a good job with teaching argument. So what happened was that we received some support from the U.S. Department of Education to bring teachers together, actually originally across 12 states, to try and design a program, a professional development and teaching program around teaching argument, which happened and was a quite extraordinary opportunity for teachers to work together nationally to kind of bring forward their very best practices in secondary, in this case, middle and high school teaching of argument. That turned into what was called the College Career and Community Writers Program. It's now called College Career and Community C3 Writers Program. But it's an intensive professional development program, has teaching resources, formative assessment tools, and it's actually been now through 3 randomized control trials, not just with the original 12 states, but actually now 20 states and 11,000 students in the RCT, and 35 states and well over 100,000 students who have participated in the program. And in all of those randomized control trials, the effects of the program were statistically significant. And I mentioned that not so much to say, yay, C3WP, but to name that teachers actually can work together with scholars, with support of their districts, to create something that actually gets results. And so it's really sort of a tribute to the potential of design thinking from great educators. Part of what happened, though, of course, if you know those years during the 2010s, We had not yet developed robust infrastructure, digital infrastructure in schools. Some schools did, some schools didn't. We had not yet had, for example, remote teaching that taught everybody how to use Zoom and things like that, which has now happened. Maybe not in the best way, but it has happened. So in fact, much of the program, and I should say we were especially focused on low income and actually at the beginning, rural districts where the digital infrastructure is even less so than those of us that are in more suburban and urban districts. So in fact, this program relied very heavily on paper. Not a bad thing. Paper is a good thing, but it certainly doesn't give the same affordances that a digital environment does. So in that program, one of the tools we had was a formative assessment tool called the Using Sources tool. Focuses on that key part of argument where young people read a lot of things. They try to pull evidence out of their reading, put it together, evidence for a claim and argument. And it's a formative assessment tool that on the one hand in the PD help teachers focus on high leverage skills, not the kinds of skills that actually distract kids from learning about argument, but the ones that focus kids' attention on key elements of effective argument. And so that was a paper tool that we used with PD, with teachers, and then later had support to make a student version also on paper. So at the start of this project, which you'll hear about starting in a second, the notion that there was this critical and very effective tool, one of a kind of formative assessment tool that only had a life in paper, but was demonstrated through this research as having significant impact in terms of student outcomes. What would it be like to put that tool in a digital environment now that we can do that? And that was part of the germ of the project that we're going to start to hear about from Victor.
All right. Thank you, Elise. So the UST was fantastic, right? It basically did everything that Elise was just discussing, but it had an inherent limitation because it was in paper. And that was obviously that it didn't sit and live in the digital work stream that essentially all the students and most of us are working and living in now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And that's what a lot of the next few slides and a little bit of time together is going to be about. But the framing of this project coming together is something that I wanted to give you an overview of quickly first. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this SBIR project, which stands for Small Business Innovation Research from the Department of Education. That is the sort of collaborative project that Scribble, NWP, and Lockport have all been working on together. So before we get into the details of that, I'm going to take a little bit of a high-level view and give you some background. So for this SBIR project, I wanted to give a little bit of history. In 2020, we Scribble started talking to NWP about basically partnering to develop different types of writing tools. And in 2022, through a variety of things, and we'll talk about a little bit of it, we ended up in a place where we were actually awarded a very competitive SBIR Phase 1 award from the U.S. Department of Education to build a new type of writing assessment system in collaboration with NWP that was based on the UST. So that is really what brought us all together in a formal project, and that's what we're going to share best practices and lessons learned about as we go forward into this discussion. So this new thing that we built, basically a sort of digital, souped up, modern web application version of UST, if you want to think of it that way, we ended up calling the Guided Understanding and Assessment of Composition, or GUAC. We couldn't help ourselves. We really love the acronym. So it's called GUAC, and there's definitely avocado logos involved in the app. But GUAC was basically inspired by UST, and it sits in the modern digital writing workflow that students and teachers live in and work in now, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But the project is what's called a Phase 1 award. The Department of Education, like many of the federal agencies, for example, National Science Foundation, who we had received SBIR funding from early in our history as a company, a lot of these federal agencies have this SBIR program. And there's some obviously differences and variations based on the agency. But with the Department of Ed, it's highly competitive. I think we were one of maybe 12 companies out of about 240 that applied last year in that cycle in which we were awarded. And in that year, so that was last year, we were given $250,000 for an 8-month R&D project to basically work with NWP to build and test Guac. And the testing portion is where, Lockport really came in, because we had to submit a proposal in which we had a letter from Bob saying, hey, we're ready to pilot this thing once NWP and Scribble have co-designed and built it. So we did that from roughly June through early November. We designed and built that product, and then it was piloted by Lockport primarily in November. And there's a timeline that we'll walk through to give you a little bit more detail on that. So we are now actually working on our phase 2 proposal. It's actually due next week. And we feel like we've got a pretty decent chance of hopefully getting the phase 2 award. It's for more money, for a longer project, and with more work. So it's $1 million grant for a 2-year project that would further develop Guac based on the feedback we've gotten from Lockport teachers and students through the phase 1 pilot that we just concluded at the end of last year. So again, just to kind of restate a little bit of what Bob said at the beginning, part of the goal of this webinar is really to sort of share our journey on this collaboration, because I do think it is rather unique, right? Sometimes you will have 2 parties collaborating, maybe a company and a district, or a nonprofit and a company, or a nonprofit and a district. But I think what's really unique is we've had 3 sort of very different organizations come together to collaborate to basically get Guac up and running and continue to try to push the envelope forward in the realm of writing instruction at a really interesting time, really partly because of all this generative AI stuff, which we're going to talk about as well. So what we have is a little bit of an overview of what the project looked like, and then we've got specific things that we're going to dive into regarding different elements of the project and try to share best practices and lessons learned along the way. So this is roughly the timeline. We were given the award in mid-May. Technically, that was a contract start date. And even though it was a grant, technically from the Department of Education, this was called basically a federal contract. So it was a contract start date. And then we had a little bit of a delay at the beginning. And this is one of the kind of lessons learned, right? We're trying to provide a fairly unvarnished view of like what went right and what could have gone better in this webinar to help hopefully other folks learn what we could do differently. But one of the challenges we had when we just getting started with the project was that because it was a grant from a federal agency, there were a number of requirements just for contracting, right? Getting registered in a federal database and all of the requirements that go along with that. And that there was a delay. It took a while because, there were sort of issues with getting registered in that database and being able to communicate with the other federal agency that was involved with that, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go into all the details, but I'll just say that, it just took a little bit longer to get going than we had wanted to. And that did actually end up impacting, the entire timeline, because 8 months is actually really fast to try to essentially build something after you've designed it and test it, all together. So we had a delay in the beginning. But then once we got going, we basically tried to adjust very quickly to change the work and the work plan that we'd originally proposed in the proposal to the Department of Education. But we started with the development process. The first step was basically doing some design thinking with National Writing Project on how to adapt the UST to this new thing that we were calling Guac. So that was starting in late June. And then we started on the prototype development. And that was, as you can see here, a multi-month development project. And when we got into it, we tried to basically do some iterative usability testing and evaluation along the way. We'd originally planned on doing it, frankly, a number of times. Because of the time squeeze, we ended up just doing it once. And there's actually a lesson learned about that we'll talk about at the end of the slide. In parallel, we decided that while our development team here at Scribble was building the prototype, we really needed to get started working with Lockport to make sure that they were being prepared and the teachers were being prepared for the pilot that was going to happen at the end. So it was a little bit like you've got to do 2 things in parallel and really have different parts of the team working on different things while that's happening. So it was a little bit complex, but it was nice that we were able to divvy up the responsibilities where Scribble really focused on the prototype development and National Writing Project staff that was working on this project really focused on helping work with Lockport to get the teachers ready for the pilot that was going to be done at the end when the product was actually built. So the pilot prep started in late July, and then there were 2 professional development sessions that were done for the teachers that were going to be participating in the pilot. And that was really important because we wanted to make sure that there was kind of common language and baseline for argument writing that was relayed, and we were all on the same page between NWP, and the teachers that were going to be participating in the pilot.
And Victor, just to jump in really quickly, that professional development, why that was so important to me and to Lori, who's on this call as well, is that really what we were coming back to is the importance of the writing process, and that being having a place in your classroom in that 50 minutes that you're with students, that process is present. You're walking through it with students, you're coaching them through their writing. And National Writing Project were the perfect partners just to reset that instructional best practice approach. I also thought this timeline was really important because guess what? Even though it's the U.S. Department of Education, they're not always on a school clock. And that was good for our teachers to experience because the whole timeline here had to make us more nimble, more adjustive, just like a good piece of writing, right? Doesn't always go the way that you plan. You got to revise, rewrite a little bit. And I thought just that experience that the whole world doesn't start at 7:45 and end at 2:45 daily, and isn't segmented on bell schedules, right?
I want to pick up on that too. And as you can see, Victor's already put up the last stages. And you can see, I mean, the main point of this timeline is both to say what I would say as they're coming up was a somewhat insane timeline of 8 months, which was shortened even by delays at the beginning. And one of the lessons learned here that we have now under best practice, and Victor, you can go back to bullet point number 1, but I want to pick up on what Bob was saying for number 2. Many of us probably on this call have been in different parts of the education system, and the life calendar, the experience calendar of people in buildings, teachers and building administrators and the young people, is one universe. And the life cycle and work experience of people in administration, people in philanthropy, people in professional development organizations is another universe. Those are not the same universe. And so many times we have funding situations or project situations that are designed for one kind of logic, let's say by the funder, maybe around their deadlines, maybe around their fiscal years, that kind of thing. And you have to figure out how that can match with the experience and timelines and calendar of the academic environment, both because semesters have real meaning, the summer has real meaning. Young people come in at the beginning of a year, and you can't convert, for example, your class from the September kids you meet into the February kids that you're going to have after you've been able to work with them for a while. So the academic calendar and life in schools is a reality. And so thinking between those two things, our partners always had to be doing that. There were pressures on teachers because the timeline may not have fit what they would have wanted. There were pressures back on the developers because we would have to say, well, that's not going to happen until after Thanksgiving. It's just not, for example. So let's deal with that. So a kind of constant iteration around the calendar cannot be overstated, the importance of it in project design.
Yes. So I agree with all that. And I think I'll just add one last thing to that, which is to make that all possible, it was a regular flow of communication, right? And that was really important between the three parties. So in the interest of time, I won't go through each one of the existing bullet points that I just popped up there, but I'll just maybe emphasize one that I thought was interesting, which is it wasn't really part of the R&D process, but we were very fortunate that we ended up working with Bob's PR team to basically film testimonials starting on November 29th, near the end of the pilot. And that is something that we've actually built into a video, which we're going to share with you a little bit later. But this is the timeline. It was a very tight timeline. And I think the best practices and lessons learned that Bob and Elise have talked about were very, very important. So let's talk a little bit about, partners and funding. So we're going to go through each one of these areas and try to go to them relatively quickly. So finding partners, right? How does this happen? How does this all come together? So we just wanted to share like the specifics. It's very anecdotal, but very specifics of how we all met. Maybe it would inspire you to think of folks that that you could potentially reach out to for some sort of project in the future that might be similar to this. Bob could probably speak to this in more detail than me, but he had worked with NWP early in his career. I think he referenced that earlier. I met Bob when he was actually on my ERDI virtual panel in December of 2021. And I remember he had mentioned NWP. And so when we were thinking about who do we, work with to pilot Guac, I remember that and reached out to him for that. And Elise and I met really, pre-pandemic, but I think they'd been on my radar for a long time because one of their studies that they had done, I think in the late 2010s, if I remember correctly, really had to do with how teens do online research, which is an important part of the story that we tell at Scribble. And so I remember reaching out to Elise and just sort of figuring out if there's a way for us to work together, and then ended up meeting her in person at NCTE, shortly thereafter. And we just sort of stayed in touch. And then if you go back to, the 2 slides ago when I talked about, we had started talking in 2020 about how can we potentially work together to develop some different digital writing tools together. And then fast forward, we ended up in this project with the way that it's being described here. In terms of finding funding, actually, Elise, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about this? Because I think you know the history here as well as I do.
Well, again, in the interest of time, not to be too necessarily detailed, but I think one of the things you see here, both in terms of what's there for finding partners and underfunding, there were a number of efforts that Scribble and NWP made together. They didn't all pay off. But one of the things that's important in the way, in terms of talking about finding partners and then funding, we didn't come together specifically only for a funding opportunity. There were connections between and amongst us that were about values, that were about intellectual background, beliefs about writing, et cetera, that then were able to be actualized through funding opportunities, and actually stayed together through several failed funding opportunities until we got to this point. And I think you all know, because probably all of you do a lot of work developing grants, that kind of thing for your districts. Each funding opportunity asks you to look at a slightly different mission and effort. And so the partnership, your intellectual colleagues, you need to have a broad sense of who you are and who they are, so that you can pivot from one thing to another and still be in a zone of something that you want to work on together. And I think that that's a particularly important piece here. We collaborated and we refined what we were doing several times. And any one of them that had been funded would have been good, because we were always pitching something that we thought was worthy of doing, and not just chasing the funding opportunity.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to emphasize really is that first bullet point under best practice or lesson learned, which is that I would really strongly recommend, certainly if there are any other companies or founders viewing this, to really try to maintain a diverse network of potentially complementary contacts, because oftentimes what we end up doing just as humans is we kind of find our tribes. And so if you're a district leader, you probably have a lot of district leaders that you know. If you're a nonprofit person, you have a lot of folks in that world. And if you're in a company, you might have a lot of contacts with investors and other company founders. But the ability to actually maintain a diverse network where you can find complementary skills was totally vital and necessary for this kind of a collaboration. And I think maintaining those networks and finding out where somebody can add something that you don't have, or where you can add value to a different kind of organization, was really, really critical, and really is, I think, what allowed us to put together a really strong proposal for this project. So now let's talk a little bit about how we manage this thing. And I do feel like maybe I should just hand the mic to Bob and Lori on this top piece. So maybe you all can talk a little bit about this. I think this is really in your wheelhouse. The leadership.
Yeah, and I'm sure many people, on this call are leaders of different sorts. And, ultimately this project was convincing first staff members, other leaders to do something that we don't always do. Professional development, very familiar. National Writing Project, I was surprised how our district wasn't as familiar, and that really emboldened me to connect our English department chair and English teachers with them. But the idea that we're going to be on the ground floor of really chasing after a writing teacher's holy grail, and that is a platform that would assist a teacher in a humanistic way of assessing student writing and giving high quality, quick feedback. What I think surprised our teachers as we were trying to enroll them was that this wasn't fully formed. You're going to help us fully form it.
Right.
That was a shift. And, if I go back and say, gosh, how could I have been clearer? Because sometimes there were surprise moments for our teachers along the way of, just they were used to, here you are, here it is. But I think as the process went along, relaying the importance of their own growth, the importance of this for their own students, and then the importance for contributing to our entire profession. We tried to address naysayers. There are people who are uncomfortable at the onset, uncomfortable all the way throughout, comfortable at the onset, ecstatic at the end, uncomfortable, all those different types of levels. And it really came down to top-notch leadership by Lori, a very influential assistant principal, and our department chair. Lori, you want to weigh on that, just kind of recruiting people into the project?
I'm not quite sure what I can add. I, by the way, Victor and Bob, because I haven't seen this before, I do love the best practices and lesson learned. And on the previous slide, the word you that was used was persistent. And I think that's what we were, just in listening. We were persistent in the listening and then navigating what we needed to do next to meet the needs of the teachers and also meet the needs of the requirements of the grant that were, put on all three organizations. And so, like leaders of all levels were always available if we needed them in the space. And Elise, I just want to give a quick shout out to Rachel, who's not on the call. Like, she was so valuable in this project. Teacher-friendly resource from National Writing Project, who really listened and pivoted to meet the needs of the teachers. But I guess I would say that leadership at all levels was available and willing to listen and shift, but still persist.
And just consistently, I think a consistent message that in the end of the day, that the agenda here is growing you as a teacher of writing. The agenda here is developing tools that you crafted, not that Victor, Elise, Lori, Bob crafted and bequeathed to you, but hey, you be the developer. And I think that persistent message, those two messages really were key to this project and to the growth of people as well.
Yeah, and actually, let's pivot to the thing then, because I think we're kind of talking around it a little bit, but it's important, I think, for folks to know what the thing was. So, we've talked about this at a high level, and I'm going to go a little deeper, but not really into the weeds of the product itself. The goal really was to translate the Using Sources tool into Guac, right? And to go from a paper form to this kind of modern web application that's integrated into the modern digital writing workflow. So here's an example on the left of what the paper form used to look like, right? And what we turned it into was this web application that has multiple components, multiple user interfaces. And what you're seeing here on the right is a screenshot of the interface that the student would be using when they're doing a student self-review of their own writing. So for example, you'll see that the paper is on the left-hand side, which was captured by them when they submitted their paper through a Google Docs add-on. And once they're in Guac and they're looking at their paper, they're presented with a set of questions on the right-hand side that prompt them to self-assess and to think critically about their writing. So in this example, I'm a student. You can see the student's fictional name on the top right there, Brad. It's not a real student. And Brad is looking at his own paper, and he's got a couple of questions that he's got to answer on the right-hand side. First, we ask him to read the entire piece of writing. Then we ask him to reread it, but this time to use annotation to identify different parts of argument, right? The claim, the source material, and commentary analysis, as you can see here, in different colors. And then what would normally happen is that he would answer some other questions, and I think there's roughly about 9 or 10 questions overall, but really some questions that prompt them to think critically about their writing. So you see here, question 3 says, does the writing present a claim? And there's a couple of different options. So Brad shows, the writing presents a claim that is debatable and defensible. And then he would click next, and then there'll be a chunk of questions, and then he clicked next, and there's another chunk of questions. So that's the review process. And there's a lot more to the product and the interface, not just this question interface. But this was a quick and easy way for us to kind of give you an example of how you translate at least the paper part of the process to the interactive software that we built in Guac.
So
now,
Victor, I want to steal some of the points from the next slide.
Sure.
While this slide is still up there. No, go on back for a second. Because what I want to point to is why we believe having teachers involved in the development process is so critical. And there are some subtleties to that. And I want to also say that for teachers, this is highly unusual. Usually, exactly as Bob and Lori were saying, people are used to getting something that is pretty fully formed and giving user feedback about tiny tweaks, perhaps. But I want to point out here, when you look at that all the way on the left, it's so old, it's got our old logo on it. That's how old that document is on the left. But the opportunity to look at a whole document all at once in a classroom, be able to say as a teacher something like, you know what, let's go right to question 4. Forget the top. We're going to look at question 4 together, class. Teachers do that with a document where you have that piece of paper and you can see the whole thing on the desk. And maybe it's being projected and you can say, look at this right here. In order to move that into a digital environment, you've got questions like, how much should you see on the screen at the same time? How much is too little? How much is too late? What would be the order? Because when a teacher is not going to be able to say to everybody, let's jump to question 4, the unfolding nature of the questions becomes something you want to watch your kids wrestle with and see whether, in fact, you want to make some changes. So when you think about what it means to move into the digital environment, it's actually a pretty sophisticated set of new questions that the paper document never had to raise for teachers. So, for example, here, the notion of how you're going to interact with that document by checking or by using scale points that are going to add up to something, how the questions are chunked, how many questions you should see together at one time on a screen before kids are asked to think about a new issue. All of those are really significant pieces of development. It's not as simple as taking a one page and turning it into something that's delivered on the web. It's a really re-engineering of the tool. So in many cases, when a teacher might be saying something like, well, that's too many questions, we would be saying, exactly. So how many questions should be together? Where should the line be? What should be the set that cluster together in a chunk before you move to the next one? And that's a different kind of engagement in the design process, let's say, than simply user testing, where you say back to somebody, you know what, it had too many questions in one line. So that piece of expertise of the writing teacher that's able to both give guidance from their professional knowledge, but also watch their own young people and be able to say things like, well, my older students were able to handle this, but the 9th graders, it was just too much, for example. That's part of what we mean by design and development with teachers. And these are some of the examples of the things where teachers actually really gave specific feedback that changed the design of the tool itself all along the way.
That's right. And I think I won't read through them, but you can see some of the changes that were decided on during the design phase. And then in the development phase, what we realized, there were also a variety of changes that we ended up implementing compared to what we proposed in the original proposal. So one of them that was very obvious was, when we first put it out there, we assumed that we'd be integrating for both the Google and the Microsoft ecosystem. But Lockport is a Google school district. So we decided that, we defer Microsoft integrations to maybe a phase 2 project and just focus our energies and our time on the Google workspace integrations. And so that was a change that we made. There are a number of other changes that we made as well. And I think one of the best practices or lesson learned from that experience was, especially that we were making these changes because of the shortened timeline that we were experiencing. Don't be afraid to deviate from what you originally proposed when you're talking to the funder. Just explain why. And most funders I've worked with, and if you've explained to them why you're making the changes versus what you promised, if there's good reason, there's nothing to be afraid of. The other thing was, we had done we got some strong positive feedback via early usability testing when we presented that type of an interface that I just showed you on the last slide to some national writing project, local writing project site leaders from across 6 different states. And that gave us confidence that we should continue to move forward and continue to build what we have. One of the things I would say that we learned was that I wish we had had time to do more of that, because I think that interim usability testing was super helpful. And frankly, if we'd had time to do more of it, we would have probably, learned some usability issues that came up during the pilot that we could have avoided. But, not to beat ourselves up too much, I think we were just under a tight timeline, so we weren't able to do that as much as I think we ideally would have wanted to.
And Victor, if I just jumped in really quickly, and I know we're kind of, there's some time and want to get your feedback, but Just a district takeaway that I'd share with district colleagues out there, and then also if there are developers out there. There's a lot of tech in here and there's a lot of platform in here, but here's a key takeaway that in our ChatGPT slide will become important as well. What we really brought back to teachers in this process was both the permission and the practice of writing in your classroom. That was the district takeaway. Strangely enough, that idea had become a little bit of a stranger. And one reason why that's so important is the best way to ensure writing integrity is if students are building it right under your tutelage, right with you as a teacher and a leader in your coaching. It builds better writing, builds better process, but also maybe insulates the writing from things like plagiarism. So that was one of the huge takeaways from our teachers, really to embolden them to kind of come back to process writing and put it right in their classroom.
So I think one of the things that was significant was that we did surround the pilot with a professional development opportunity. Bob and Lori have both spoken to that, and that was a joy. It was great to work with the Lockport teachers. And part of that was that the tools are intended to be embedded in the context of process writing, as Bob just spoke to. And so what that meant, and then how do you insert the pilot into it, and then how do you learn from it, was something that we needed to do. We were encouraged to work with other places by reviewers, but our late start that Victor talked about with some of the bureaucratic material from the Department of Ed meant it was really impossible to bring people in at the last minute, because again, the timeline of the academic year is the timeline of the academic year. And it does make a difference if you can talk to people in July versus the beginning of September. And so in many cases, as we get here, you can see that surrounding the opportunity with things that actually also feed the teachers, as well as take their expertise and use it to inform, is very important. And there are going to be those kinds of challenges that you need to work about. I think one of the other things that's here as a best practice or lesson learned is this piece around detailed specific info in advance. You can't, and we would have loved to have done more at the beginning. The more that especially people in the buildings, teachers and their administrators, can know in advance and can trust with consistency what's going to happen, the better they can plan for the whole of their teaching life. So teachers don't have a lot of room to make pivots and changes and that type of thing. They're working with all kinds of constituents, especially like about 150 of them, for example, every day, that need to have some consistency of expectations. So we need to do that for people in buildings, for teachers and for administrators. You can't spend too much time in that orientation phase. And if just to answer one question there from Jennifer, since we may not get to a lot about ChatGPT, this project, the testing of the project was over about the time that ChatGPT appeared on the scene, which was at the very end of November, and we were wrapping up the pilot at that point. We are thinking a lot about generative AI in phase 2, but for the concern around plagiarism and things like that, Jennifer, that you mentioned, I just say echo Bob's comment before, that when we're supporting process writing and teachers are able to see all the way along, what is the topic this kid's working on? What are the sources that they've already put into the system and that they're going to cite? The chance that you're going to get a fully ChatGPT piece of writing is highly unlikely. You're going to know that because you've been watching the kids work on their writing all along. This tool fits into that process approach.
Yeah, and I skipped ahead to that slide because I'm sure at least some of the folks, if not many of the folks on that are watching this, are probably very interested in this because it's a hot topic of discussion in their schools. We concluded the pilot a week after ChatGPT launched. So GWOC, as it was envisioned, was really envisioned and designed and built in a pre-ChatGPT era. And what's interesting for us is that, we had the option, I suppose, way back in February of last year, or maybe even earlier, to think about in sort of infusing GWOC, or what would have become GWOC, with AI. And we actually sort of preferred not to do that at that time. There was a lot of hype that, and a lot of interest in AI and writing. But we sort of preferred a non-AI approach at that time to support what I've been calling human capital development of teachers, right? If you go back to that problem slide from the New York Times that talked about, and Bob talked about, the little amount of training that teachers oftentimes receive in writing instruction when they're going through their training. Well, that doesn't get better if you just basically outsource the assessment of the writing to software. And part of the goal of Guac, I think, originally was to basically help teachers become better writing instructors by giving them tools to scaffold their ability to do the writing assessment themselves. And so we didn't originally start with an AI approach. But I think one of the lessons that we learned is that, well, the world changes, right? And so that was not the original approach, but near the end of our project, ChatGPT launched, and obviously the world is changing very rapidly because of it. So the reality is teachers are now asking, how will I know if my students really wrote the paper? And I think everything Elise just said about process writing is right on the money.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on another point, and that is to just everybody here of different sorts. There's also a school climate and culture issue here. I think for quite some time, a kind of criticism of my profession, English teaching, although I'm a superintendent now, is that there's been an amazing amount of plagiarism catching going on. I'm reading this paper. I'm going to run it through different algorithms to sort of catch. And I've always tried to say to English teachers, just think about that dynamic, that if I'm trying to catch you doing wrong, for me, it pushes students more towards ill uses of generative AI, but it also creates a sort of relationship as judge or an evaluator rather than writing coach, who's leading you through some tough questions that can't be answered by AI, can only be answered by you, the author, in your authorship. Really different relationship of catching your plagiarism versus coaching your writing. Leads to different outcomes entirely.
Yeah, and I see a comment in the chat from Andrea, who was instrumental in making this all work, working with Lockport. The whole idea that you focus on the end work product versus the process, I think is significant when you're thinking about how to tackle the challenges and the anxiety around ChatGPT. If your students have gone through the process and you have tools like Guac or other tools that help you sort of see the work as they're doing it, then you have confidence in knowing that they've actually gone through the productive struggle to develop those critical thinking skills and those cognitive skills we've always expected them to have when they go through the writing process. And so in that way, we do think that this tool is part of the answer or part of the solution to the concern about, whether students have done the work and whether they're getting the skills that we really want them to get. We are pulling together our plans for the phase 2. As Elise referenced, we are thinking about how to incorporate machine learning into the phase 2 proposal. So I won't go into a lot of details, but just, we didn't start with an AI approach with phase 1. The ground shifted under us as we were wrapping up phase 1. So now we're thinking about how we can actually leverage machine learning in an interesting way that still stays true to the idea of human capital development. And so that is something that we're thinking about and we're planning to build in part of phase 2.
Yeah, I wanted to open it up for questions. I know we're close to time, but did want to ask if anybody does have any questions to please jump in.
So obviously ChatGPT is now in its 4th iteration, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a game changer. I've had a chance to use it, experience it, and I thought to myself, gosh, this AI tool is going to take away creativity. Literally, students don't have to think anymore. Not only does it provide responses, but it also will give you a roadmap, and it will do everything for you. And so this is really a hot topic across the country. I'm hearing a lot about it. In my district, I'm in Springfield, Missouri. We have not tackled that issue just yet, but it is coming. We know the kids are using it. We know that it's prevalent. And so I've been listening to all types of information about it from across the country about what different districts are doing and different approaches. And that's why I wanted to kind of chime in today. So thank you. This has been an insightful conversation this morning. I'm wondering what will happen with this particular tool, because sometimes it does provide inaccurate information. There's a lot of very inaccurate information. I actually typed in my own name to see what it would say about me, and it had me as like a teacher somewhere, and it had all kind of false information. I think it kind of confused me with someone else. So there's still kinks and bugs to be worked out with this, but I'd like to know, just from Lockport, what are your teachers thinking, especially your English teachers? What are they thinking?
Yeah, and Andrea Cobbert's she's on this, she's closer to the ground. What I've sussed out is we actually have a very I think there's a divided group. We have teachers who've already jumped into using ChatGPT. Oddly enough, our world language teachers, and they've picked up on something that you got to ask the right question. If you don't ask a good question, you won't get a good response. Now, if you just put Ron Woodward in, but if you put in Ron Woodward superstar, of course, you know what I mean? How is Ron Woodward a superstar? You'll get a ton. But then we also have teachers who are pressing us hard to have a board policy and to use our digital networks to block it. And so we're working through both of those. And you can probably guess where I'm at is that, as you said, it's going nowhere. Just like Google, I remember there was a time when I was a tech director and people were asking me to block Google, block search engines. Well, that's not going to be practical, right? Could you imagine our lifestyle as schools 20 years ago started blocking Safari, right? But one, you brought it up, asking really good questions. This tool is useless if it doesn't ask good questions. But and you know what we're working on with Guac and with Scribble in the classroom is asking good questions of yourself in your own writing. And if those are original to you and to what you're writing, ChatGPT isn't going to be a surrogate for you because you're going to have to ask those questions. You're going to have to build those, walk through a process that builds them. And ChatGPT is going to be maybe of some help, but only marginal help in giving up an original answer. So that's a little bit of how I'm thinking about it, how different teachers are thinking about it. It's funny that our world language teachers are using ChatGPT because many of them have referenced how Google Translate was going to be the end of world language instruction. 10 years ago here in Illinois, I don't know if in other states, but the University of Illinois Computer Science came out with this thing called Wolfram Alpha. Check it out, Wolfram Alpha. It was a search engine could answer any mathematic question. And we won't need math teachers, just have kids log into that. Well, that kind of turned out to be a nothing burger, right? Because kids can get the answer, but Wolfram Alpha did all the calculation, right? So it could do the homework, it couldn't do the test, you know, so it didn't really become the threat that people thought it was. And then teachers figured out how to work with it and use it.
Ron, a quick comment and you said you were in Missouri, I think. There's a very well-developed network of writing project sites in Missouri. We have right now a lot of work, as you would imagine, writing teachers and scholars and researchers around generative AI. It's consuming all of us. And also the journalists and writers we work with who are also trying to figure out who are already writers, and that is their profession. And what does this thing mean for their process and how do they use it? We have a number of online modules about it and materials that teachers could use in PLCs if they wanted to take some time in PLCs to study it, think about it, make school policy, that type of thing. So I'd be happy to have you or anyone else who would like to access some of those supports for teachers who would want to take it up, to think about, not take it up necessarily to use, but to actually understand it and then make policy locally. Refer them. You've got my email, I think, earlier in the slide deck. We have emails. Oh, it's right there on the last slide. Happy to help because it's consuming all of us right now, for sure.
Well, I want to be mindful of time. I know we're a few minutes over, but thank you, Bob, thank you, Elise, thank you, Victor, for sharing your journey and the conversation around ChatGPT, which of course is continuing to evolve. I promise my closing remarks are my own. I did not, run them through generative AI, but just wanted to thank everybody for being here. Thank you everybody for joining the conversation. We'll go ahead and post a link to the recording, as well as some additional opportunities that we have coming up.